Okay, welcome to our second podcast on the upcoming 2019-2020 high school policy debate topic on arms sales. I'm here with Dave Arnett. Dave Arnett is the director of debate at the University of Kentucky under Dave's coaching. This year his team was the Copeland Award winner for the top-ranked team at the end of the regular season, and they also won the college national debate tournament. Dave's been involved in debate since the early 1990s, so nearly 30 years of policy debate, debating and coaching and participating in every way, including being the director of the Tournament of Champions. So gathered Dave here today to share some of his thoughts on the topic of reducing arms sales. So Dave, thanks for doing this. Welcome, and kind of thought we'd start with just getting some of your general thoughts, on the topic area and maybe the resolution generally.
Yeah. Well, like you said, I'm old. Not old enough to remember the big high school arms sales topic in the early 80s. That's before
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Late 70s, early 80s. Yep.
And I know people talked about it really fondly. But it was before my time. And so for such a salient issue, we really haven't directly gotten at it. So I think it's really exciting. Now, I think there are some general things I would say at the beginning. One is it is a very large topic, and not in the way that people always say, oh, the topic's so big, and when they're writing their theory blocks or whatever, but really big. There are lots of different arms, and there are lots of different countries, and so it's huge. Now, it also may be simple. So it may be big, but it's a simple topic in that you have a very clear mechanism and a very clear thing that the mechanism is intending to affect. And so you reduce arms sales to a group or country is relatively straightforward. Now, once we get into camp, maybe we find that you can reduce arms sales by adding a process to it, and maybe that adds some complexity, but still, I think going into it, it is both a large topic, but it is also a simple topic. Now, I'd say the second thing that I would say about the topic is there's not a lot of unified negative ground. And I know I've talked to other folks and listened to other folks' thoughts on this, and it seems like everybody's on that page already. But it's going to be tough for the negative to figure out what the generics are that really apply to these little cases in some random country and some random weapon system. And, for example, on the college topic last year to restrain presidential power, you always had the executive order counterplan against small apps. And it was a naturally built-in check on the size of the topic. I do not know what the generic arms sales argument is that narrows the topic. I don't know, Stefan, if you've got thoughts on that, but
well, the problem is there's so many different regions, so you can't say, well, my generic disadvantage is China when somebody runs like a Middle East affirmative.
Yeah, right.
And there's going to be evidence both ways about whether or not cutting arms sales, helps U.S. leadership or hurts U.S. leadership. So that, that gets complicated.
Yeah. So, there are big thematic issues that come up in arms sales. Whether or not those in practice are really generics against these AFs, especially the smaller AFs in practice, that's going to be an interesting question. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But those are my kind of introductory thoughts on the topic. I think it's great. Arms sales literature is fantastic, but it's very large, and it's going to be very tricky for the negative to figure out how to be prepared.
Is there anything about the wording of the resolution that stands out? I know you said it's pretty straightforward, and that is one good aspect of it. Is there anything any of the words you think might become kind of important either for figuring out the size of the topic or types of cases or counterplan strategies, anything like that? What words maybe become debating about particular meanings of words, how will that play out?
Right. So I did kind of look at these words and dig around a little bit. I'll say one thing at the outset, um, and I know it's always a battle, and it's a battle in high school. I think substantially will have to matter. I see no other way to limit out these small asks than to fight this fight. And, you know, people in college and high school are pretty cynical about that word having an effect. What I will say is that um, theory, including topicality, tends to adapt to the topics we have to make it fair. And so when substantially is in a topic where we don't really need it, it doesn't matter. When it's in a topic that we need it desperately, it's going to matter more. And so I think crafty negatives are going to have to really dig in. And I don't know what the answer is, but you know what you want to limit out. You want to limit out the weapon of a week to some small country that links to nothing. And so, you know, you want to say that the app has to be big, and we'll spend the summer probably figuring out what that means. But I think that is one of the things that I look at this wording and make it have to matter. I also think reduce may matter. I kind of mentioned above that apps may try to implement a process by which the effect could be to restrict arms sales, human rights standards or any number of other criteria that could be modified from the status quo. And that, gosh, I mean, if already you have to deal with all of these small arms sales apps, and now if you have to debate an app that maybe doesn't even reduce on face, I think that is at least a topicality argument that I'd want to be up on. And then just I just dug in a little bit on foreign military sales and direct commercial sales, and just learned a couple things and then had a couple thoughts. I mean, one thing is, so foreign military sales, FMS, is the process where the government transfers arms to countries or organizations. And direct commercial sales are where a country can buy from a company in the U.S. And so the government isn't directly involved, although there are criteria that the government follows that these companies have to follow too in terms of who they can sell to and whatnot. But one statistic I saw that really jumped out at me is that for FMS alone, there are 179 countries and international organizations that participate in FMS. That's mind-blowing to me on the scale of, and if substantially doesn't mean anything, then there are at least 179 apps, in my opinion. And when you multiply that by single weapon apps, it gets mind-boggling. And so I just stared at that for a long time, thinking about the scope of it. The other thing I would say is, I haven't fully thought this out, but the topic says is very specific to arms, and so like the FMS program, for example, is broader than arms sales. It it does training and other services that help build relationships with other countries and stuff that you cannot reduce topically. And so that to me is interesting. Simplistically, like solvency arguments, I'm not sure apps will be able to necessarily solve all of the broader implications of military presence that they might want to go after, with a big Saudi Arabia app or whatnot. But I don't know, that stood out to me. But really the main thing that stood out to me is how big FMS is. And then I'm not sure how many countries get added if you add direct commercial sales, but you're literally talking about most of the world, right? So
yeah, I think the terms are pretty interesting, in addition to just selling them the arms, right? There's, an interesting question about like, well, they already have a lot of arms. Mm-hmm. It kind of becomes a negative argument. But one thing I learned researching some other topics this year for LD and public forum there about arms sales is that it's actually the parts and training are actually considered parts of the sale itself. So the company sells the weapon, then they have a long-term contract, right, to like service the system. So I think that that could expand the topic even more if you can figure out some way that maybe just maintaining the sales of the parts, is significant. Look on the affirmative, but also, how you would kind of combat a negative argument that they already have the weapons. So these are two very broad categories, I think, which generally constitute arms sales. I think the writers of the topic just wanted to clarify maybe that both were included.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing I talk about, just kind of based on, your experience in debate, you say we haven't debated this topic directly, but, we had a reduced military presence topic in both high school and college debate that were similarly worded. We have a lot of, this year the topic was about the executive power of the president, which involved the military issues. We've debated a lot of, we debated China topics, debated Middle East topics. A lot of the topics in debate are generally, or have been about foreign policy and U.S. military presence abroad. So I'm just kind of based on, all the years you've been in debate, are there any things that, kind of jump out as you maybe like, might be good cases, or at least something to, start with?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, to step back, I think, the approach that my own squad takes and the approach that I counsel folks in the summer is to start big. There's an old UK debater named T.A. McKinney who was top speaker at the NDT in 1991, and I asked him how to be good at debate, and one of the things he said about developing an AF was to take a shotgun approach to the library, which is now on your computer, but the principle is still the same, that before you know what the good AFs are, you need to know what arms sales and the topic is about. And so just like jumping in and reading a lot to figure out what the lay of the land is, I think is an important first step. I also think starting big teaches you things that small AFs just can't. And so, on our squad, we always start with something that we perceive to be heart of the topic, both because we know it's going to have a broad literature set. It also helps us on the negative by teaching us more about the topic. And what we find there is that having that sustainable year-long affirmative, we also will find things in that literature that allow innovation. And so you can develop smaller, trickier AFs from that literature base oftentimes. So, for example, Saudi Arabia seems like very core of this topic. Lots of very good recent literature about, and it's just deep, and they're going to have answers to the negative arguments. And but you also, from that literature base, you could write a big AF, and you could definitely probably tinker around and ban a specific weapon that Saudi Arabia is using in some specific context that could give you advantage ground. And so I really encourage folks to start big, and then from there move to smaller AFs, which I do think have a lot of utility, especially in what we call GFO, or good for one situations, that really important debate that you need, especially towards the end of the year, a big, a TOC bid round or a big elim at a tournament, where that small, tricky AF that may not be sustainable for a whole year, but it's definitely good for a few big debates. And so that's just kind of like thematically how I like to coach my teams to start. Now, my initial reaction on this topic are there are two main types of cases. There are, and that might be too simplistic, but there are weapon systems, in specific arms, and then there are country-specific AFs, and kind of they can meet in the middle. But I could see weapons specific that applies to different countries, like uranium.
Bullets, uranium bullets. Maybe missile defense. Right. You can have general debates about missile defense.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something wrong with like whatever the newest airplane is, the F-35, or right. So
never ending.
Right.
It seems like.
Right.
And,
so yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it too.
And I think those AFs, I suspect in a lot of situations, those AFs will be designed to either no link out of the generic arguments or turn them by saying that if you ban a bad weapon system, a good system will come replace it. And
Well, it's even that the sales, when you say replace it, I hadn't thought about that. Like the sales could increase. So maybe the U.S. government stopped selling weapon A. Well, that creates pressure to sell weapon B.
Right. And you can have little T debates, but it's not.
That's just like an effect of the plan. Yeah, it's not the plan itself, right? So the plan, like on face, as you say, reduces the sale, the effect of that is to increase more sales.
Right.
Well, that kind of gets tricky because that proves they wouldn't shift to alternative suppliers. Yeah, right. It makes a lot of those arguments kind of quite interesting.
Yeah. And then, of course, they're country specific, like the big Saudi Arabia, or in Asia, big Korea or Japan or Taiwan arms sales obviously is enormous. Now, I don't, do I think, again, I think these questions are related because is cut all arms sales to Taiwan a good F? Probably not, but is cut a specific bad system good that then flips deterrence?
Because, even in the context of Saudi Arabia, they try to say, well, still sell them defensive weapons. Now, that's obviously in the eye of the beholder. But, yeah, you probably wouldn't really want to cut missile defense sales to Saudi Arabia, but maybe you cut some supplies or planes that they're being used in the bombings in Yemen. Or you could cut some weapons that are hard to get from alternative suppliers. Right. And yeah, you're right. It doesn't make a lot of sense probably to cut all our arms sales to Saudi Arabia, but there may be particular weapon systems that maybe like China's especially upset about. And that nuance then, it's like the affirmative can always get ahead on the distinctions debate. It's hard for the negative to keep up. If you're trying to debate specific arguments, it's hard for them to keep up with all the different distinctions, right? Like the affirmative can always move the debate and say your cards don't assume this weapon and the impact it has on, like strategic stability or arms races. This one is uniquely destabilizing, right? Yeah, the other ones are not, like.
And from round to round, the F can change their story. And that's why, that's a good back to my point about, pick a big area, but then innovate within it. And maybe you say, we're going to be the Asia team or we're going to be the Taiwan team. But that doesn't mean we're reading the same F every round. And in fact, just when the negative is caught up to one version of our F, we can tweak it again. It seems like even within something like missile defense, you could have, a half a dozen different takes on it.
Right. Well, a couple of years ago, it worked out. It was like one of the public forum topics was like missile defense to South Korea. And during that time, there's a huge debate about THAAD.
Yeah.
Right. So it kind of got a little lucky. But just within that system, there are thousands of articles published about whether or not, I don't know if it was a sale or we gave it away. That was a little bit of controversy too. But just within that one weapon system within that one country, it's like an enormous debate. So
sales, I don't know, sales seem to get defined as can be heavily subsidized.
Right.
So
now, where were you thinking, like kind of common disadvantages, anything, I know you're struggling, it's tough at the beginning, like, and you asked me, like, what really links, right? Besides politics, you can always link that thing.
Yeah, I would start with politics because you're just not going to be guaranteed a big link to these other generic arguments that we'll talk about. But, God, even politics is tough because, a lot of these changes for the small Fs, I don't think require congressional debate. And so it could just be some internal...
Or the president could really just decide not to, maybe just decide not to sell.
Right.
I think the president has to submit a review. That's something we need to look at, in terms of, there'll probably be some process arguments, right? Like, I think the president has to submit a review for approval.
But does that go the other way? Like, there is definitely congressional review as part of doing an arms sale. But cutting an arms sale, I'm not sure.
You're not sure. But the president might just, like, decide not to, right? Because the thing is, the affirmative can only stop future sales. You could break a contract, but they can't. They're not like they're going to take the planes back. Right. So it'd be more maybe the affirmative, which actually creates interesting questions around reduce. Right. So does it mean if you reduce something, does it have to be like a contract in process? Right. Because the contract's in process, when you break it, I guess that reduces the sale.
Right.
If you say, well, we're not going to submit, the president's not going to submit this sale for congressional approval. Well, does that reduce sales if it was never like approved in the first place?
Yeah.
So to limit the topic to breaking agreements is kind of a, we agreed to sell these weapons to Taiwan. Now we're gonna tell them we changed our minds. I guess that definitely links to, that links to disadvantages more than maybe not like proceeding with some other sale that like we haven't really got around to.
I think that's a really good point.
I hadn't really thought about that
haven't
until
either.
we had
Yeah.
this discussion, right? Cut a sale off midpoint is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But there'd probably be some arguments, I guess, about like allied relationships, maybe a little tricky, right? Because your meaning of your allies changes, right? Like Saudi Arabia doesn't really do probably much for us in Asia, maybe a little bit, but not much. Helps us out in the Persian Gulf, whereas Taiwan's kind of important to China and East Asia. And
Yeah, so you've got, kind of finding generic ground. You've got this hegemony
right.
and allies kind of argument. And there are great cards that arms sales, have more than their direct effect, have kind of indirect relationship building aspects to them.
Or it might make countries, if you're Japan and the U.S. cuts off arms sales to Saudi Arabia, you might, think, oh yeah, Trump probably didn't really do this for human rights.
Right.
He did it because he, wants to cut back U.S. presence. But, so maybe you get a little nervous and you otherwise would. But yeah, I think it's going to be tough to find a common argument. Now you might not need a ton. Maybe you have one that's kind of about the Middle East, one's about Asia.
Well, yeah, that hegemony
one's about
argument,
Europe.
You've got to start from the assumption that it's not a generic hegemony DA.
Right.
It is region specific.
Maybe like China threat, Russia threat.
Right.
Maybe add Iran threat at the most.
Exactly.
Right.
But optimistically, you still are going to have to write.
Like three,
a bunch of different disads, and you got your Latin America.
Yeah.
It's daunting.
Well, and it's daunting too, because like you said earlier, the affirmative is always going to draw these like doesn't apply to us arguments, and then you got to keep up with all that. So, maybe you're better off just going for the CAPK. I don't know.
I don't know.
Consult NATO counterplan. I don't know.
Weaponitis.
Yeah. It's going to be a little tricky, but
there's some other I think generic disad kind of areas, like I think the defense base economy disad. That the defense industry is looking at future contracts, and that I think the tricky way to write that disad is a little bit perception based, and to say that those contracts impact their like R&D, like how much those companies are willing to invest in other areas, and then you can get to cool impacts based on that R&D. I don't think the generic economy disad is going to go very far, but we had sort of a related argument on this past topic, where we said for a nukes aft, the no first use aft, we said that if we adopted a no first use policy, that would signal to the defense base to like stop investing in nuclear R&D, and we had all kinds of spillover, fusion and get to space and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I think there's a similar.
I like those too, because once you brought up, with the general argument, it's like, well, how much does this sale matter? Like, is it gonna spill over? But if you're like, hey, the defense industry is considering making investments in fusion, right, this makes a difference. It's kind of like the old spending DA with like X is on the chopping block, right?
Yeah.
But it makes some sense, right? Like they're starting to make investments in, developing like space-based technologies, like. Some of these things are a little riskier than others. Mm-hmm. If they see there's going to be cutbacks, then maybe they won't get as much investment.
I don't want to oversell it, but like I think, that's.
Well, I think it helps beyond the general argument,
right?
Yeah.
But being able to take these generic ideas and try to make them apply to little ass is the trick. The other big core generic areas got to be like other countries fill in. Russia, China. Fill in with sales, and that's worse. Russia's more destabilizing for the Middle East, or China's more destabilizing for Asia or whatever.
And it strengthens their defense industrial base too. Like I actually found a pretty good piece of evidence on that, right? So it's kind of the U.S. is losing, but Russia's also gaining, right? So it's all relative, right? When it comes to military competition, so you're kind of pushing the resources maybe in a direction you don't want to push them, and then maybe Russia's economy is a lot more constrained in the U.S., so they need the revenue even more for their arms industry than
right. So there might be a smaller threshold,
right?
Which maybe applies to smaller apps. Now you got to have links to all these things.
Yeah.
And so it's challenging, but I don't know. Those are kind of the main generic DA areas that I've been thinking about. And again,
so you would kind of maybe summarize those as like U.S. politics, U.S. defense industrial base, maybe external threats, that we, 4, maybe relationships with our allies, and then maybe 5, like fill in from other countries.
Right.
And, I think too, that's a lot, right? Like as, debaters to tackle. But I think the other point related to what you brought up earlier, when you're reading these articles, even if you kind of say, okay, well, in the end, I'm not going to fully develop my defense industrial base disadvantage, you're probably going to find a lot of good evidence in there along the way that's useful to debating different impacts or arguments.
Yeah.
So,
there's one other thing I would throw in here. We played around with a little bit and had some success this year, but the classic debate, take something that's bad and turn it into good, like instability good, especially when teams are struggling to find generics that link to these small AFs, you can at least say, well, instability in this region is good because, Middle East instability is good because of oil prices.
Yeah, that's like the classic, like it raises oil prices and then there's more of a transition to like renewable energy, or it benefits some of these economies, and then that's actually good. So
yeah, so it's not, again,
the good thing about those in debate sense is like the teams conceding the link. You can debate like the internal link threshold, like how much instability causes renewable energy. But with these other things, they're really going to fight you on the link. Like,
exactly.
How much does this like one weapon system matter? Even $1 billion, like, you say, okay, it sounds like a lot. Like the defense industry made $1 billion, like selling these weapons to this country.
Yeah.
Our defense budget is $700 billion a year, right? And that's just so you have the U.S. demand plus the weapon sales to all other countries, right? So you're looking at like an industry that's worth over $1 trillion. $1 billion, as they say, might be a rounding error, right? So, but once they say instability, they say instability.
Right. The trickiest Middle East F is probably still going to claim Middle East instability.
Right. So it gives you some protection. That's good.
That's some thought.
How about any counterplan ideas? Especially with so many apps, right? It's hard to fight off kind of all these advantages. So any thoughts on counterplan?
I got at least 2 kind of initial thoughts here, I guess. One is conditions, and I know we've talked about this. We both think this is a big area, because the one thing that we know AFs will do, and we have to focus on the mechanism for generating some stable negative ground. We know that they eliminate arms sales, and with that, they eliminate whatever leverage the United States has to use those arms sales for productive political or economic ends. And so, instead of reducing those arms sales, we could add conditions to them, whether it be human rights reform or economic reform or protect some endangered species. Some of this has to be answered by the literature, but I do know from the outset that conditioning arms sales is a huge body of literature that you can take and turn into a million different little condition counterplans. And so I think that's really big, and something, because it's so hard to find other generics that work, is something I would invest a lot of effort into. The other area that I was thinking about is old school offsets is sort of similar to this idea, but I think in a lot of situations you could probably counterplan to increase arms sales and make that compete. And so maybe find arms that are, good, and you just sort of counterplan in a disad effectively that, Taiwan needs this X weapon system. We're not selling it to them. It would stop a war. Now, the competition is not like rock solid, but I think you've got a fight there that's winnable. And that could also be like, giving arms to dissident groups, or, give non, defensive weapons, or, all kinds of that. And so in any country, in any situation, there are going to be proposals on the table of things that we should be selling them that we're not. And I think finding a way to turn that into counterplan ground that, even if it's not quite the opposite of the AF, at least builds you in an impact to be able to talk about in that region or in that country is probably something. But those are like my 2 ideas from the outset. I mean, process-wise, I'm just not sure. It's not, like I said, the executive order counterplan and like the Asian debates were built into our college topic. That is not as clear to me. Maybe there are some things that are normal means, but not things that are going to be in the plan. So I don't know that you've got the built-in court counterplan or anything like that on this topic.
Well, one thing, you mentioned those counterplan, those three counterplans, and then just, from coaching high school debate for many years myself, one thing is like I find that learning how to debate counterplan competition is like very, very important, right? Because, the first set of counterplans, like, what does reduce mean? And a lot of the competition debate's going to come down to that, because I know, even from researching Saudi Arabia extensively, almost no one argues for just, you can find many quote unquote affirmative articles, right? But almost no one really argues for just an outright ban. They're almost all arguing for some condition in the end. And then, so, I think on the affirmative, you're going to want to try to fight those counterplans off a bit on competition, or you're going to get stuck. I think, the offsets, like you say, I mean, that's like a huge competition debate, right? In terms of like, does the counterplan really competing with the plan, or is it the resolution, or like all these kind of things gets a little more complex. And then you bring up the old school, like, agent counterplan. It's like, well, if you don't say federal government, can you really say, well, yeah, but that means you have to defend all three, or like, which is kind of been answered a little more in one direction, but it's obviously kind of a theory debate to be had. And then you have your whole questions of process, like we were kind of alluding to, like, well, what if does the plan have to have Congress pass a law to ban it? If they do, can the executive not submit it? Which one is normal means? Can the affirmative, the affirmative's not going to write normal means into their plan, right? So, does the affirmative have to kind of defend normal means, and what then the negatives gets the counterplan with abnormal means? That all sounds a little strange, right? So I just think like learning to debate counterplan, especially if you're listening to this and you're planning to go to camp, like I think that's something, if you learn how to debate counterplan competition, it'll help you a lot just generally in debate, but on this topic, especially because look, the negative, they're going to struggle to debate all these weapon systems, regions, permutations of all those. What if you bring a small affirmative? What are they going to do? They're going to pop up, say 7 off, have like a spec, probably kind of a bad topicality argument. Two counterplans. One of them, at least one of them being a process counterplan. The politics DA, a random DA that like is defense industrial base. They'll try to win the debate on, and then maybe some K. Some language-oriented K, right? Because it's harder to K, like reductions, right? So, like you said, weaponitis, and what are they going to go for? They're going to go for their K or their process counterplan and politics, right? So that's where the debates are going to head.
Yeah,
right.
Necessity really influences theory trends, and so, like I said, I think on this topic, I think you're absolutely right that like, these counterplane competition debates are going to be more important than they have been maybe in recent years, just because what is the negative going to win on?
Right.
And I think the same thing is true of like T, and substantially is going to actually have to matter. Well, and I think a late elim of the TOC may be decided on you're too small. And, in college we kind of say topicality matters at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. And, beginning of the year when you're sorting things out, and the end of the year, and the TOC is like that, where it's a new app every round. But yeah, these skills are going to have to be developed for the negative to have any chance, for sure.
Right. And then lastly, we really talked about K's much. It's easy to, obviously the affirmative K ground's going to kind of be like militarism type oriented, retcon, all the old school Ks. The negative, obviously you can K. I think especially like these smaller apps, like they're a little more vulnerable to like your like, reformish type Ks of like, sure, you like cut this weapon systems, but this just reaffirms like, the military, you say you get rid of the bad weapon, you assume everything's good, that sanitizes all the other weapons we have. You can see Ks along those directions, but, what are your thoughts on maybe what will kind of become the dominant Ks on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, well, I do think, for the app, there's good ground to read, topical K-friendly apps. I mean, and talk about militarism and weapons, and that seems great. And I would definitely, to kind of get back to the app discussion, I'd be thinking, what do I want in my toolbox? I want a big app to start the year. I want a K-friendly app, and then as the year progresses and we start having these, really important debates and late elims, I want to start then developing, small little tricky apps that maybe we read for a couple tournaments or less. In terms of critique arguments, I mean, I do think I think the old weaponitis argument is going to be strong, that the AF identifies sort of arms as the root cause of conflict when we need to look at structural arguments. And so whether we call it weaponitis or positive peace or all of these arguments are going to resurface. And I think it's great. I think those arguments are relatively sophisticated. They have lots of different link arguments, and there are lots of cards. And so I think it can be a very card-heavy critique here that's very topic-related. So I think that's exciting and good. I think it's a little bit kitchen sinky in that I would also have my security KAF stuff, and then also like that in the context of different regions. And so I have my China arguments and Middle East Orientalism arguments, so that, because a lot of these apps are not going to say, a lot of these apps are going to like claim deterrence advantages by like we said, making stuff better. So you need to be able to go on both directions. If they go soft, you need to say you're just focusing on the symptom, not the cause. And if they talk about deterrence, then you need to be able to talk about the security critique, threat construction, self-fulfilling prophecy type arguments. But
it's interesting if you read some kind of K in the one on C, and you read some other argument about, I wouldn't really make it about deterrence because this is like contradict, but to try to prompt them somehow to say that they increase weapon sales. Then you're kind of like,
Well, and you can read, critique arguments will make some of these arguments we talked about. They can kind of sneak in like shift arguments. And those kind of solvency arguments into their line by line extension, and that's very strategic and that's smart. There is actually a capitalism angle that was relevant on military presence, our military presence topic a few years ago, that we reduce when we reduce military presence, maybe we replace that with like trade promotion.
Because we want to maintain all those relationships.
Right. So one way or another, you just move around how the U.S. is going to, push its
general
its
imperial empire type K. With capitalism.
So I can see that as well. I think it'll be a good critique topic, but I also think the AF is going to have a lot of good built-in intrinsic offensive arguments and good link arguments to make. So hopefully that makes for a good topic.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Dave, for your insights. Yeah, I mean, this
Absolutely.
Topic, even just talking, I mean, there's just a lot. I mean, I don't know. I've been involved in debate, too, for a long time. A lot of stuff's pretty interesting. Even like you say, hearing kind of a little bit, bring weaponitis back, positive peace. These arguments get stuck in here and there. But this is a good time, to do some new research on those arguments and really...
Absolutely. And I think, coaches have gripes about how we're going to be negative and what we're going to do. But at the end of the day, we get to have a year where we cut cards on the arms sales, so that's usually fun, and the neg finds a way. They always do.
All right. But thanks a lot. Thanks for your time.